The history of Buddhism is the story of one man's spiritual journey towards enlightenment and of the teachings and ways of life that developed from him. The Buddha, or Siddhartha Gautama, was born around 567 BCC in a small kingdom just below the foothills of the Himalayas. It is said that 12 years before his birth, the Brahmins prophesied that he would become a universal monarch or a great sage. To prevent him from becoming an ascetic, his father kept him within the confines of the palace. Gautama grew up surrounded by princely luxury, shielded from the outside world, entertained by dancers, tutored by Brahmins, and trained in archery, fencing, wrestling, swimming, and running. When he came of age, he married Gopa, who gave birth to a son. He had, as we could say today, everything. And yet, it was not enough. Something as persistent as his own shadow drew him to the world beyond the castle walls. There, in the streets of Kapilavastu, he came across three simple things: a sick man, an old man, and a corpse being carried to the place of burning. Nothing in his life of comfort had prepared him for this experience. While returning to the palace, he passed a wandering ascetic walking peacefully along the road, wearing the robes and carrying the single bowl of a sadhu. He then decided to leave the palace in search of the answer to the problem of suffering. Bidding a silent goodbye to his wife and his child without waking them, he rode to the edge of the forest. There, he cut off his long hair with his sword and exchanged his fine clothes for the simple robes of an ascetic. With these actions, Siddhartha Gautama joined a whole class of men who had left Indian society to find liberation. There were a variety of methods and teachers, and Gautama investigated many: atheists, materialists, idealists, and dialecticians. The deep forest and the crowded market were alive with the sounds of thousands of arguments and opinions, unlike our time. Gautama eventually got to work with two teachers. From Arada Kalama, who had 300 disciples, he learned to discipline his mind to enter the sphere of nothingness. But though Arada Kalama asked him to stay and teach as an equal, he recognized that this was not liberation and left. Next, Siddhartha learned how to enter into concentration of mind that is neither conscious nor unconscious from Udraka Ramaputra. But this was not the liberation either, and Siddhartha left his second teacher. For 6 years, Siddhartha, along with 5 companions, practiced austerities and concentration. He conducted himself without mercy, eating only 1 grain of rice a day, pitting mind against body. His ribs stuck out of his spent flesh, and he looked more dead than alive. His 5 companions abandoned him after he made up his mind to eat more substantial food and abandon asceticism. So, Siddhartha entered a village in search of food. There, a woman named Sujata offered him a bowl of milk and a separate container of honey. Having regained his strength, Siddhartha washed in the Niranjana river and then set off for the Bodhi tree. He spread a mat of kusha grass under it, crossed his legs, and sat down. He sat down, having listened to all the teachers, studied all the sacred texts, and tried all the methods. Now there was nothing to trust, no one to turn to, nowhere to go. He sat solid and still and determined as a mountain, until finally, after 6 days, his eyes opened upon the morning star, it is said, and he realized that what he had been searching for had never been lost, not for him or anyone else. Therefore, there was nothing to achieve, and there was no longer any struggle to achieve it. Wonder of wonders, he is reported to have said, this same enlightenment is the nature of all beings, and yet they are unhappy for lack of it. This is how Siddhartha Gautama awakened at the age of 35 and became the Buddha, the awakened one, known as Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakyas. For 7 weeks he enjoyed the freedom and tranquility of liberation. At first he didn't feel like talking about the realization of it. He felt that it would be too difficult for most people to understand. But when, according to legend, Brahma, head of the 3,000 worlds, asked the awakened one to teach, since there were those whose eyes were only slightly clouded, the Buddha agreed. Shakyamuni's 2 former teachers, Udraka and Arada Kalama, had died only days before, so he sought out the 5 ascetics who had left him. When they saw him approach the Benares Deer Park, they decided to ignore him, since he had broken his vows. However, they found something so radiant in his presence that they got up, prepared a seat, washed their feet, and listened as the Buddha turned the wheel of Dharma, the teachings, for the first time. The Buddha's first noble truth asserted that all life, all existence, is characterized by dukkha, the Sanskrit word meaning suffering, pain, dissatisfaction. Even moments of happiness tend to turn to pain when we cling to them, or, once they have passed into memory, twist the present as the mind makes an inevitable and desperate attempt to recreate the past. The Buddha's teaching is based on direct perception of the nature of existence. Dukkha is noble, and it is true. It is a foundation, a springboard, to be fully understood, not to be evaded or explained. The experience of dukkha, of the workings of the mind, leads to the second noble truth, the origin of suffering, traditionally described as craving, thirst for pleasure, but also, and more fundamentally, thirst for continued existence, as well as non-existence. Examination of the nature of this thirst leads to the heart of the second noble truth, the idea of the I or I, with all its desires, hopes, and fears, and only when this I is understood and seen as insubstantial that it becomes realized the third noble truth, the cessation of suffering. The 5 ascetics who heard the Buddha's first discourse in the deer park became the nucleus of a community, a sangha, of men who followed the path that the Buddha had outlined in his 4th noble truth, the Noble Eightfold Path. These bhikshus, or monks, lived simply, possessing a bowl, a robe, a needle, a water strainer, and a razor, as they shaved their heads as a sign of leaving home. They traveled through northeastern India, practicing meditation alone or in small groups. The Buddha's teaching, however, was not just for the monastic community. For the next 49 years, Shakyamuni walked through the villages and towns of India, speaking in the vernacular, using common figures of speech that everyone could understand. As the Buddha's fame spread, kings and other wealthy patrons donated parks and gardens for retreats. The Buddha accepted them, but he continued to live as usual from the age of 29, like a wandering sadhu, begging for his own food, spending his days in meditation. But now, there is a difference. Almost every day, after the noon meal, the Buddha taught. The Buddha died in the city of Kushinagara at the age of 80, after having eaten pork or mushrooms. Some of the assembled monks were dejected, but the Buddha, lying on his side, his head resting on his right hand, reminded them that everything is transitory and advised them to take refuge in themselves and in the Dharma, the teaching. He asked questions for the last time. There weren't any. Then he uttered his last words.
I remind you that all conditioned things are of the nature to decline and cease. Free of heedlessness, develop yourselves and benefit others to the utmost.
It is said that in the first rainy season after Buddha's parinirvana, 500 elders gathered in a mountain cave near Rajagriha, where they held the first council. Ananda, who had been Buddha's assistant, repeated all the discourses or sutras that he had ever heard, and Upali recited the 250 monastic rules, the Vinaya, while Mahakashyapa recited the Abhidharma, the compendium of Buddhist psychology and metaphysics. These 3 collections, which were written on palm leaves a few centuries later, and known as the Tripitaka, became the basis for all subsequent versions of the Buddhist canon. And this is the story of Siddhartha Gautama, or the Buddha. Please subscribe to support the channel, and I hope to see you in next week's video.